The fog had been thick when I left the infirmary 7 cycles ago, but now it is impenetrable. It smothers this outpost like a blanket. Even my receptors can barely pierce the obscurity, forcing me to navigate by memory alone. There are figures in there, shambling, growling things that hunted me. It was by the blessing of the Omnissiah that I was not found. It was only in necessity that I left my sanctum to re-establish the connection to the Vox relay station, so that I might send this message. I believe I have succeeded. Opening the door was a termination sentence, but considering the revelations I have made in recent cycles, this was only a hastening of the execution. I had to tell someone, anyone, and with what time is left, I pray that my efforts will not have been in vain. Forgive me. My mind is distracted. My designation is Galen Kappa 7, Junior Adept Biologist, assigned to the mining colony on Gatton Major. My duties here were as a physician, healing the sick and injured in their dangerous work extracting the natural resources of this rogue stellar body. I had held this post for 3 Martian Standard years, and in that time maintained an above-average survival and productivity rate amongst the miners. I was a good physician. The sickness began nearly 21 cycles ago, 3 weeks as the layfolk put it. There were complaints of pain and stiffness, of a lack of movement in the joints, akin to advanced osteoarthritis, or the onset of rigor mortis in an improperly prepared servitor. There were no immediate physical evidence for these symptoms, but such conditions are not uncommon on low-gravity planetoids. I administered the appropriate pain dullers and returned the affected individuals to their shifts, seeing no reason to harm the production quota. They could work, and so they would. Then the fevers began. A heat in the body that would not abate despite the administrations of proven techniques to rebalance the humors. I initially suspected that it may be a bacterial infection from an off-world food or water supply, and enforced a ban on the most recent shipments. I isolated the victims and suspended all other duties as physician, letting no one and nothing into or out of my infirmary. It made no difference. First, there were a handful of new cases, then dozens. Then within 3 cycles, fully half of the outpost population were in my beds or on my floor. Extraction operations ground to a halt for the sheer loss of manpower, and the lifters from the merchant flotillas refused to land when they heard of our plight, declaring a quarantine. The victims did not heal. Their fevers did not abate. Their nervous systems began to misfire, their minds wandered far, and delirium took hold. After 4 cycles, a form of rheumatism set into the eyes, the iris clouding and the sclera beginning to yellow. Those who were still cognizant reported to a blurriness to their vision before it was lost entirely. Many were distressed by this, even through the haze of the delirium. I did what I could for them. 7 cycles into the outbreak, I had ceased to receive messages from any other personnel, a fact that I had not noticed, engaged as I was in treating the afflicted. When I assessed the external oculi, their picts were obscured by a strange mist, though I could see that the outpost was abandoned, the habs either sealed tight or voided, the vehicle bays empty. I do not know where the miners had thought to go on this barren fragment of a world, but I could not blame them for running. More victims were lying in the streets and piled outside the door to my infirmary, but there was simply no more space. At this point, the earliest and most advanced cases began to exude a thick vapor from their mouths, coming out in distinct clouds as if they were breathing in a great frost. The joint stiffness had advanced to a state comparable to extreme tetanus infection. The mouth was hinged open and unable to close, the vapor pouring out in a steady stream. My diagnostic sensors recognized it as a particulate composed of huge quantities of oxidized organic material. My olfactory sensors indicated the smell of ash. I kept these victims as isolated as possible, but space was limited, and their numbers only rose. They were almost entirely unresponsive. Rapid eye movement had ceased and higher brain functions were barely registering. Yet still the vapor flowed, thicker and heavier, and their bodies became lighter with every passing cycle, graying skin pulling taut over bone. Perplexed, I decided to perform a vivisection. I am a scientist, a servant of the machine god. My realm is the biologus, the study of matter and living things which, above all else, follow the blessed laws of logic. The human body is a machine in which all actions and reactions, all component elements, no matter how seemingly illogical, can be explained with sufficient knowledge. I could not explain what I found inside that body. As soon as my scalpel split that woman's skin, reason ceased to rule the universe. Omnissiah, forgive my heresies, but I cannot explain what I found inside. I can only describe. The victim was entirely devoid of blood, exsanguinated in totality, with the veins and arteries either collapsed or having burst under extreme pressure. The organs were shriveled husks a fraction of their proper size, whilst the bones were blackened as if they had been placed in a fire. A layer of ash clung to all, stuffed between the joints, filling the gaps in charred ribs and coating the inside of the epidermis in a persistent, immovable layer of grey particulate. The lungs were shriveled and useless. The diaphragm was missing entirely, and yet the chest continued to rise and fall. The vocal cords were snapped and broken, and yet the victim continued to vocalize throughout the procedure. Nerve clusters were gone, and yet stimulating the deposits of ash that filled their place resulted in the same reactions one would expect from a stimulated nerve. The body was hollow, yet still it lived. It was as I began to make the incision into the skull that the victim changed. Arms twitched and spasmed. The head thrashed from side to side. Its vocalizations grew guttural and aggressive. The vapor pouring from its unhinged jaw, which seemingly had no source within the body, thickened and became a steady stream of ash, which spilled into the open chest cavity and onto the floor of the operating theater. Stumbling on stiff limbs, the victim attempted to stand. I sealed the thing inside the operating theater, muffling the sound of its violence behind the blessedly thick bulkhead. With all the speed the Omnissiah could give me, I gathered the remaining victims and threw them out of my infirmary, out of my sanctum, into the lightless streets. Twitching bodies tumbled inwards when the exterior door opened, some of them already grasping at me with stiff fingers, ash trickling from their mouths, but I threw them back, casting them away to rot outside with the rest of their kind. As soon as the door was sealed again, I initiated purgation protocols, pumping the air with antivirals and scrubbing every trace of ash from the floors, the beds, the walls. I stripped my clothing away and coated myself with the highest concentration sterilizers I possessed. My remaining flesh burned in agony at the cleansing touch. The foul vapor was sucked away and ejected to join the fog that lay thick outside. Gatton Minor is a small planetary fragment with barely any atmosphere clinging to its surface. It has no true weather, and it lacks the necessary conditions to develop any, even with the ample waste gases and humidity produced by the colony. It cannot have fog, and yet, there it was. Locked within my sanctum, there was naught to do but continue my work. The victim in the operating theater appeared to calm after several hours without stimuli, moving randomly in its halting fashion between one wall and another. It did not eat. It did not sleep. Its vocalizations did not tire. When I pumped the theater with antivirals, it was driven into a rage, but it did not die. When I removed the air from the chamber, it seemed confused and disorientated, but it did not die. The ash continued to pour from its mouth. Outside, the fog grew thicker, obscuring the oculi that I could access. About half of the victims had become animate, wandering aimlessly through the streets of the outpost, occasionally clawing and vocalizing at each other. The rest simply lay where they had fallen, spewing ash. I watched them and logged their behavior until the fog became too thick and I could see nothing at all. A single specimen had escaped my manic purge, a finger from one of the earliest victims, shorn off in my rush to evict its owner and having rolled under a bed. Wearing 3 layers of isolation gear, I retrieved the digit, removing several samples before incinerating the remainder. This allowed me to continue my studies on the microscopic level to see if anything could be gleaned from its virology or behavior as a microbe, whatever it could be. The disease in micro makes as little sense as it does in macro. It appears in one sample as a bacterium, in another as a virus, in yet another as a kind of conglomeration of loose proteins that should not function. It acts in one moment as a predator to healthy tissue, in another as a swelling cancer, following no rhyme or reason. Antivirals cause its cell to shrink, and heavily concentrated doses seem to destroy them entirely. Yet new ones will form from free-floating base molecules or grow in healthy cells without any prior contact. It is maddening. With physical evidence abandoning me, I turned to my records, feverishly scouring all of my collected Medicaid knowledge for something, anything that could explain this nightmare. And I found it. After sleepless cycles, I found it. And it is so much worse than I thought. The hollow rot. The phrase was buried in aged records from the macro stack that serves as my diagnosis guide. It was an obscure disease reported millennia ago in the fringes of the subsector, soon after the end of the reign of Goj Vandire. The ancient Medicae spoke of a malady of the body in which the victim, alike to a corpse, yet animated by a great fury, vomits forth an ashen breath. It was a fanciful tale, coming at a chaotic time and from a handful of backwater worlds, so no authority had deigned to investigate. Eventually the cases subsided and it was simply consigned to the long history of inexplicable illnesses, or else dismissed as another mad story from the age of apostasy. Yet one condition now stood out across the reported cases. The afflicted worlds had all been in the graphitic ejection zone of the great warp storm that appeared at the height of Vandire's reign of blood. The storm of the Emperor's wrath. Gatton Minor is a fragment of a world, a remnant of a planet long since shattered by that great etheric disturbance and cast adrift in the void. Subsector Titus is full of them, and this particular body was nothing special, save for the fact that its long exposure to space and its passage close to the twin stars of the Gamma Tellari system had recently deemed it free from taint. The macro bombardment of solar radiation and the sheer lack of life had reduced warp presence on the surface to acceptable background levels, and thus, following standard procedure, it was approved for mineral exploitation. And so we came. We were fools. The true taint was never on the surface. It had sunk deep, deep beneath, leaching into the ground like a chemical spill. It was in the very earth itself, in the iron and the adamant that we dug for, a festering remnant of the Empyrean adapted to create what? A psychic virus, a demon in bacterial form, a disease that carried the unraveling touch of the warp itself. The taint was in the rock, in the stone and the very minerals. Those cases from the far past may have been caused by similar planetary fragments, meteorites that had been cast adrift by the great storm and plunged down onto unknowing worlds. And now it is here again, in the ore we dug, the veins we plundered. It is in the shipments we sent off worlds, in the holds of the macro haulers, the lungs of the crew, in the smoke and steam of the blessed forges. By the Omnisire. The forges. It may even survive in their constructions. In the spires and ships and countless other fruits of my kin, it lies dormant in the metal, but it thrives in the flesh. In my fear, I have refused to acknowledge the truth in front of me. I had prayed that my enhanced immune system and lack of organic lungs would keep me safe from this disease. They have not. My joints are stiffening. My flesh has been feverish these last 2 cycles. My mind begins to lose its focus. My eyes fail. I am infected. Soon I will become like the others, a wandering rabid thing of accursed illogicality, a crime against the motive force. For that, I can only beg the Omnisire's forgiveness, and pray that in my final moments I may serve them still. I have set a subroutine in place through the colony's central machine spirit, though even it has slowed and grown directionless in the midst of this infection. The oculi and sensors shall record what data they can and transmit it to the orbital satellites, along with all my findings and this message. There, it will remain safe from infection, and I pray will one day be recovered. When I have failed to upload the failsafe code for 3 cycles, the thermic reactor will cast off its bonds and overload, destroying this outpost and all who still linger within. It is the final mercy I can grant them, and myself. There shall be no further transmissions. With all that I have learned so far, I shall spend my remaining cycles in contemplation and communion. Perhaps I shall find forgiveness there, or perhaps it will merely placate the fear that whispers in my mind, the terror that tells me to abandon my faith, to leave the blessed teachings of the machine god and embrace this new mad universe I see before me. I shall not. By all the strength of iron and the certainty of logic, I will not give in. I remain a servant of Mars. This is Galen Kappa 7 signing off. Motive Force guide me. Omnissiah forgive me. Deus ex machina cleanse me. The buzz would drive him crazy. Klaus Meyer had the reputation of being a meticulous and thoughtful man. He did not let himself be guided by instincts or emotions. On the contrary, he always took his time to examine each situation with patience and an open mind, and then calmly arrived at the only possible solution. It was in this way that he had earned the respect of the inhabitants of Weiserfluss, a prosperous town in Talabekland. Sheriff Meyer doesn't steal paychecks. Sheriff Meyer doesn't yell and threaten to ensure order. Sheriff Meyer makes sure the guilty always pay. These were the opinions that an outsider might have gleaned from the inhabitants of Weiserfluss, if he had bothered to question them about the local law enforcer. Of course, if this supposed traveler had looked carefully, he could have also found discontented and dissatisfied people, who would have welcomed a change at the top. But they would have been isolated individuals, whose voices would not have affected the panegyric on Klaus Meyer much. But the truth was that even Klaus Meyer had limits, and that evening the annoying and constant flapping of little wings an inch from his ears was quickly eroding the thin veil of patience he was clinging to, while trying to get to the bottom of the reports that cluttered his office desk. "Go away," he growled, waving his hand madly to try to ward off the insect that had approached his face. He watched with hatred as the fly flew away, buzzing loudly and banging its plump, hairy body again and again against the glass of the closed lantern. "There. Continue like this and die. Do me this favor." Klaus rubbed his temples and let out a groan of tiredness. He had never found himself in such a situation. Awareness and impotence gnawed at him from the inside, hollowing out his features and marking his eye sockets with heavy dark circles. 6 suspicious deaths. 6, and not even within 3 weeks. 6 murders, practically double what Meyer had witnessed in 7 years of honorable service in Weiserfluss. Murders, of course, because what else could they be? 6 people with healthy minds and bodies until the day before were simply found the next morning limp, like empty bags, their eyes wide with horror and with a trickle of blood wetting their lips. It simply wasn't possible. And no, it wasn't a contagion, despite the hysterical screams from his fellow citizens upon discovering that the first victim was not an isolated case, but the beginning of a sinister series. Obviously, Klaus had his doubts too. It would have been infinitely foolish not to consider that possibility, but in that case his cold and rational mind had been helpful. Instead of setting the houses and belongings of the victims on fire and never thinking about it again, as his frightened citizens had suggested, he had chosen to get to the bottom of things. Of course, he had quarantined sites and people in close contact with the victims, but that was precisely the point. None of the subsequent victims appeared to have anything in common with the previous one. There were no family or business ties, nor did they share the same places. Furthermore, none of the people in close contact with the deceased had developed any suspicious symptoms, nor was there any indication that they were not in perfect health. Wives, relatives, partners, drinking buddies were, to use the words of Dr. Bauer, who was assisting him in the investigations, in corpore sano ergo. They had not been infected by any disease. Indeed, Klaus Meyer deduced that the poor people had not fallen victim to some damned plague. No, something more sinister was at work in Weiserfluss. A devilishly sharp mind. A murderer. Or maybe even more than one. The insistent buzzing of the fly seemed to have increased, as if it wanted to mock his reflections. With a grimace on his face, Klaus observed that 2 other insects had joined the first, forming a malevolent trio that scuttered across the glass of the lantern. "I hope those damn little legs of yours burn," he wished them through gritted teeth, fighting an incipient headache. So, murder it was. Klaus tried to reconnect the frayed threads of his thoughts, trying to ignore the buzz that seemed to have become, if possible, even more turbulent. A deviant mind, but terrifyingly clear in its intentions. He looked back at Dr. Bauer's report. The victims' relatives had protested, of course, but Klaus had no regrets about having given the doctor permission to open the victims' bodies for a more thorough examination. And for good reason. None of the deceased seemed to suffer any damage that would justify the fact that he never got up the next day. No wounds, no bruises. In short, no plausible reason for not being alive. Except for the expression of dismayed horror on their faces. But well, nobody can really die of fear, right? Logic and science were opposed to it, and Klaus firmly believed in both. Again, that damned buzz so similar to a mocking laugh. But how many damn flies were there in that office? 7? 8? Klaus made a mental note to go and check the adjacent room that served as a pantry. In the frenzy of the last days of investigations, he or some of his men must have left some food scraps. This must have attracted the insects. Yes, it must have been so. So no apparent injuries. But there was blood on the lips, and Klaus had followed academic studies enough to know that, if there was a clear and telltale indicator of poison ingestion, well, this was it. Hence the unpleasant task entrusted to Dr. Bauer. The fruits of that examination were now there before him, written in tiny writing and letters that overlapped in Meyer's exhausted mind as the sheriff struggled to decipher them in the flickering light of the lantern, in front of which the damned flies continued to dart incessantly. Deciphering the doctor's writing was a difficult task for his tired eyes, but the more he laboriously advanced in the writing, the more a placid, albeit dark, sense of satisfaction made its way within him. He had hit the mark. The medical report revealed extensive damage to the internal organs. The oral cavity, the stomach, and the entrails seemed, to quote Bauer verbatim, reduced to mush. In a side note, the good doctor revealed that he had also found small abrasion marks around the mouths and nostrils of the poor people. So here it is, the killer's signature. An acid, perhaps, corrosive if ingested, and whose effluvia had then also damaged the orifices of the mouth and nostrils? Of course. If that was the case, Klaus couldn't help but wonder why there were no signs of struggle in the victims. A person does not simply stand still while an acid turns their internal organs to mush, unless they had previously been drugged, put to sleep and paralyzed, and forced to suffer such a terrible fate in chilling and forced immobility. Klaus was no coward, but he couldn't help but shudder at the thought of such a horrible death. For once, the flies didn't seem to have anything to comment on. Their droning was now a soft background noise. Now that he had discovered the how, Klaus moved on to the next question. Why? Besides deviant madness, what justified those murders? As disturbing as a revelation, a greenish light invaded the room. Geheimnisnacht. Immersed in the investigations, Klaus had completely forgotten that this was the night of sorcery. He remembered it in the moment when his gaze lifted from the papers towards the window. Neither the clouds nor the curtain of flies could in any way hide the green and luminescent shape of Morslieb, the cursed moon. Under the unhealthy light, the flies seemed to go crazy like never before. Klaus shivered again. Is it possible? Klaus was a man of logic and solid convictions. He wasn't a fool. He knew well that there were forces at play in the world that went beyond the human. In his experience, he had met Sigmarite priests and magicians, and he had witnessed their powers. He also knew, however, that despite what simple and superstitious souls might think, these were exceptional cases which only on very rare occasions affected everyday life. After all, with all due respect to his panicked fellow citizens, there had been no demonic and bloodthirsty cult behind the death of Farmer Hans 2 years ago, but only his neighbor's clumsy attempt to cut up the body and hide it after a banal argument over boundaries of the respective fields. Just as no evil demon had been responsible for the bad harvest of the previous year, nor had any ghost caused the collapse of the bell tower during Klaus's first month of service. The sheriff could say he was proud of having always spared Weiserfluss from the ever-watchful eye of the witch hunters. From his own experience, he knew that sometimes calling in such forces did more harm than good to a quiet village like theirs. Cold blood, logic, and scrupulous investigations. This was how he had always enforced the law in Weiserfluss, at least until today. Klaus Meyer had never doubted that he had the ability and means to solve any problem he encountered in the performance of his duties. But even a cold and rational mind like his could falter on a night like that. Logic or not, the light of the cursed moon had the power to distort even the most trivial situations. And that was definitely not a trivial situation. Under that greenish halo, even the normal words written on normal paper took on a much more disturbing and sinister aura. And after all, why shouldn't they? His own logic did not allow him to dismiss the possibility that there was something more in those crimes. 6 victims before Geheimnisnacht. That was not at all a factor he could afford to exclude. Maybe there had been nothing abnormal in the way the crimes were carried out. Acid had been used, right? Until a few moments ago he was quite sure of it. But now, the increasingly loud and insistent buzz shook him. With a decisive shake of his head, he pushed a fly away from his face for the umpteenth time. Even leaving aside the question of modality, there always was a why. Why carry out those murders? Why in that atrocious way? Why so close to Geheimnisnacht? Maybe this time he had to swallow his pride and admit that he had neither the means nor the answers to get to the bottom of it. Maybe it was really time to turn to someone higher up, someone specialized in that kind of horrors. The cloud of flies was now shaking angrily, so loudly that it was reminiscent of the sound of a disturbed beehive. Why didn't they leave him alone? If only he could think clearly. Frustrated, he reached for the mug of beer left in the corner of the desk, seeking comfort in the familiar taste of the drink. He spat out the contents immediately. The flies. The damned flies. They had also entered the beer. The knowledge of having had those disgusting chitinous bodies on his tongue almost pushed him to vomit. In the throes of retching, he bent over the desk, strewn with beer stains, in one of which a fly was still struggling, frantically flapping its translucent and soaked wings. Klaus screamed, leaping away from the desk and crashing into the back of his chair. The fly had a human face. No! Fear and denial in the face of the impossible. It couldn't be true. Yes. How many flies were there in the office now? Dozens. More. Enough to lose count. Enough to drone with a single rhythm. With such harmony and unity of purpose as to modulate the buzz into sounds, words directly in Klaus's shocked mind. Accept it. So close, yet so far away. This is the night. 6 nests so far, and soon there will be 7. Not murder, not death. We are life, from 1 to infinite. We are the swarm. Accept it. Welcome us, become the 7th. Walk in the garden with us. No! No, go away! Klaus waved his arm desperately, trying to keep the swarm away that was now entirely surrounding him, in vain. He felt hundreds of little paws walking on his skin, hundreds of little wings buzzing in his ears, hundreds of little jaws opening and closing on his face, getting closer and closer to his nose and eyes. Instinctively, he closed his eyelids. "Leave me alone!" Screaming was a mistake. The swarm descended on him, forcing his mouth open in horror. It entered him. As he struggled helplessly and blinded, Klaus felt the flies buzzing inside him, felt their merciless and excruciating bites. An acid. I thought it was an acid. He would have laughed madly if he could. He would have cried desperately if he could. The swarm had taken away even that meager consolation. Prisoner of his body, he existed. He was writhing. He was suffocating, and he suffered. As the swarm feasted on his entrails, his rational mind granted him one final blessing. In a final flash of lucidity, he saw the 6 bodies of the victims who had preceded him. Dead. So at some point, the buzz would die down. The flies would retreat, and he too would find peace in death, finally free from the excruciating pain. It had to be like this, right? Gorvan walked down the dimly lit corridor outside his workroom in deliberate silence, his ears processing every sound that came out of the darkness in front and behind him as his eyes scanned the graffiti-covered walls. Just under 6 feet tall, with the shaved head and the featureless slab of a body that only came from a lifetime of hard manual labor, there was nothing to set him apart from any other common underhive dweller apart from his clothes. He was shirtless, with thick workman's pants and an apron that granted him a greater degree of safety than most. Gorvan had little to worry about outside of drug-crazed vagrants or the random cannibalistic madmen that came up from the deeper levels with that apron on. In the center of the stained and creased canvas was a large, grinning skull, but where its teeth should be were instead the rounded and spiked machinery that identified his stock in trade. A corpse grinder. One of the blood-drenched wretches that fed the machinery of the city's nightmarish abattoirs of human meat. Everyone, from governors to street gangs, needed people like him to keep the hive city streets clear of bodies and the bellies of its citizens full. It was that relative safety that allowed Gorvan to concentrate on the crude paintings and carvings on the walls in his section of the city. You had to pay attention to those. Gangs used them to mark territory, and fresh ones were always a prelude to warfare, meaning more bodies and greater difficulty getting them to the grinders. They were also warnings of other, more horrifying denizens. Gene stealers marked routes and ambush points, while cultists and heretics put up strange symbols to their dark gods, in hopes of gaining their favor. If you managed to live as long as Gorvan had, you could name the threat with just a glance. As he continued his daily patrol, Gorvan saw nothing new, but there was a scratching along the back of his neck, a feeling that something was out of place, despite his normal senses telling him everything was as quiet as it could possibly get in the filthy halls and rooms of the hive's bowels. Gorvan had almost finished when a splash of color caught his eye. Near the ceiling of an intersection, just barely touched by the light of the ugly yellow fluorescent bulbs, was a collection of bizarre icons, arranged in a strange pattern that Gorvan didn't recognize. He dug a small flashlight out of a pocket and looked closer, trying to find anything familiar in the random-looking jumble of glyphs. Seeing nothing, he committed as much of it as he could to memory, marked its location in his head, then continued towards the large blood-splattered room where he would be spending the next 14 hours feeding the dead to a machine so it could feed the city. The door to the grinder room was a wide plate of 6-inch metal that swung inwards after Gorvan's eyes were scanned by the security panel. Instantly, the hallway was filled with the stench of blood, viscera, and human waste that no amount of air venting and extraction could erase. The floor, walls, and ceiling were coated in centuries of splatter that had sunk deep into the metal, and there was no cleaning the constantly spinning machinery. The grinders could never be fully shut down, not even for maintenance, so the stench of rotting flesh was constantly being blasted out into the workroom. Gorvan took his air filter mask off a hook just inside the door and strapped it on over his face. The mask could not block the stink, but it did make it tolerable for those used to it. Drez was already hard at work hoisting bodies off the pile in the near side of the room, piercing the bare feet with twin hooks, then hoisting them into the air to prep them for the grinder. The young man pulled a slim, razor-sharp knife from a sheath on his apron and began slicing the clothing off the line of corpses he'd already strung up, tossing the filthy rags into a large bin nearby. He glanced over his shoulder and gave Gorvan a slight nod in greeting, then returned to his work. Drez had only been on the job a few months, but had managed to settle in quickly to a position that crushed most people given the assignment. Gorvan rather liked him, and he found himself looking forwards to the brief minutes they had together at lunch to banter back and forth. Walking to the center of the room, Gorvan unhooked a long hose from the ceiling and turned a large dial. The grimy rubber swiftly fattened up with the chem mixture that would sterilize the bodies and strip them of hair and minor skin growths. Gorvan's own knife would take care of larger abnormalities, and a handsaw dealt with any limbs beyond use. After the room was filled with enough corpses, they would both hose off the bodies with a second inert chem before starting the final gruesome task of heaving them into the shrieking maw of the machinery on the far wall. Within the hour, the aprons and exposed skin of both men would be covered in gore, looking like a pair of monsters conjured up from a child's nightmare as they kept working. Not that they had to worry about scaring anyone. Nobody wanted to go anywhere near the grinder factories unless they had to. Gorvan's room was rather unique, as it did not have any direct contact with its factory except for the machinery. It was the only remaining piece of another section that had been destroyed when its power supply had overloaded and melted most of it to slag centuries ago. Gorvan enjoyed the isolation. He didn't like crowds, and in here, he never had to worry about being drafted into harvesting parties. Eventually, the first batch of corpses was finished, and the pair dragged the dangling bodies to the end of the rack near the far wall, where the mouth of the grinder spun and snapped. Grease and congealed blood ran down the bottom and onto the floor, as if the machine was drooling in anticipation of its next meal. Gorvan and Drez unhooked the first body and fed it head first into the opening, where twin cylinders covered in spikes took hold and began dragging it in. Blood and tiny pieces of flesh spat out irregularly onto the two men as they guided the rest of the cadaver into the machine, followed by more as they continued to supply the beast with fresh meat. Past the mouth, the bodies were hammered and pounded into a thick slurry of skin, muscle, organs, and blood that slid down a funnel into a large vat. When full, a series of large blades would rise from the bottom and begin blending it all into fine liquid as it drained out into the processing area, where starch and vitamins would be added before the congealed substance was cooked, diced into cubes, then packaged, and sent out into the city. In a few days, some of the people eating this fresh batch would be hanging from the ceiling in this very factory. Hours passed in grim silence as the endless supply of bodies was stripped, cleaned, and pushed into the grinder. The monotony was only briefly interrupted when a body needed extra attention or a chain snagged along the line. As the morning wore on, the men were gradually covered in thicker and thicker layers of gore, while the floor underneath the grinder became slick with blood. The stench became like a heavy miasma that stuck to their clothing and began weighing them down. Finally, Drez stopped hooking up bodies and picked up a wide-bladed shovel from the floor nearby. He then began scooping up the blood and depositing it into a trough beside the grinder where it flowed down a crusted pipe into one of the vats below. Finished, he grabbed some of the ragged clothing he had cut up and used them to wipe up the remaining fluids, then tossed them back into the bin as he resumed stringing up and stripping the dead. Drez had cleaned up the blood twice more before Gorvan tapped him on the shoulder. "Lunch," he said plainly. Drez nodded and followed Gorvan to the chemical rinse, where they took off their aprons and cleaned themselves off as best they could. Hanging up their masks, they picked up the rusting tin containers that contained their allotted rations, then stepped out into the hallway. Closing the door to keep the stink from floating out, each man sat down on a plastic crate and began to eat. Meals for corpse grinders were always a bleakly humorous activity given their trade, but it was easy to look past when your stomach had gone empty for several days. That's how Drez had found himself not so long ago, starving, sick and desperate for a safe place to sleep. On his first day, the youth had dry retched for nearly 30 minutes after opening his bar of corpse starch. On his second day, the bar had been devoured in seconds. Now Drez took his time, taking swallows of recycled water between bites, sometimes making a sandwich of it with his dry biscuits. He was almost done when he turned to Gorvan. "Notice anything odd this morning?" he queried. "Why'd you ask?" "I don't know.
I passed the night shift on my way here and, I don't know, they looked different. Something about the eyes. Like they were all focused on something. And I could swear there were fewer of them today.
Gorvan shrugged and took a large bite of his nutrient bar. Probably nothing serious. Been a while since the last big gang war. Maybe somebody decided it's been long enough and they needed extra help bringing in the harvest. These are hard days, lad. Bodies pile up to the roof and it's a rush to get them all processed before the rot sets in. Administratum don't like it when that happens. Sometimes they send down the PDF to hurry things along. I heard one time an Inquisitor showed up and a whole factory team vanished. That many bodies lying around makes the higher-ups nervous for some reason, and you can end up burning a good chunk of the crop on their orders.
Dres rolled the thought around in his head for a moment. I guess that would explain why I haven't seen a lot of gang members around here the past few days. Probably means things will be quiet around here for a bit.
Gorvan snorted. Don't get to thinking that's always a good thing down here. Gangs are almost always the first to know if something's gone wrong under the city. And I'd rather have them be the ones to run into a pack of heretics or Xenos first instead of me.
Ever seen a Xenos?
Nah. Heard tell that a nest of them was found outside the city once and got wiped by the guard. But that was before you were even born.
Have you been a corpse grinder all this time?
It was the first time Dres had ever asked Gorvan something even remotely personal, and the older man felt oddly pleased that he was showing any interest. Since I was 16, he replied. I worked in the service and waste tunnels until I finally got too big to fit in most. Truth be told, there are times when I'm glad the guild found me. It's ugly, but the grinders are the only steady source of work down here. Necromunda. He spat the name like a curse. Must have been able to see the future when they named this rock. Oh, I meant to ask, have you seen any odd markings around your hab recently?
What kind of markings?
Strange writing, pictographs, that sort of thing. I found some this morning, but I couldn't figure out what it meant. Keep your eyes a bit more open for the next little while, just in case. Could be a new smuggling route and it's best to stay out of their way. Their lunch break over, the pair went back inside, tied on their aprons and masks, then resumed the long, bloody toil that kept them fed and sheltered. Despite their efforts, the piles of bodies never seemed to shrink, just changed shape, as limbs and torsos bent and fell over as Dres removed one at a time and hung them up on the blackened hooks. The faces all blended together as he and Gorvan pushed them into the grinder's maw, their nude bodies unceremoniously dangling in the air until the machine had devoured enough of their flesh for the men to let go and bring the next one. They were about to lift a large-bellied man into the steel teeth when it slipped from Dres's hands and fell. The corpse hit the steel floor, and the enlarged stomach burst open in an explosion of gases and organs, splattering both men with viscera and body waste. Parts of the man's intestines hung like bloody sausages off Dres's shoulders, and what looked to be most of his liver was stuck to Gorvan's face like a pie in the old comedy vids that played in the hab units. A low, wet wheezing leaked out of what Dres assumed was the stomach as it deflated like a balloon. The stench rising out of the bloody cavity overwhelmed their masks, filling each man's nostrils with fetid air. Gorvan slowly reached up and peeled the ragged organ off his face and tossed it aside. Both men stared at each other for a long moment, saying nothing.
I guess that one wasn't so fresh,
Dres finally said. Gorvan coughed, then chuckled, and finally burst out laughing uncontrollably. Dres could not help but join in, and soon both men fell onto their backsides in the pile of gore, roaring with laughter until their sides hurt and neither man could breathe. Gorvan tried to stand, but slipped on a pile of ruined organs and landed flat on his back, starting a fresh round of howling. Eventually, with deep, red faces and burning lungs, the pair was able to stop and return to their feet. Gorvan grabbed the corpse by the legs and dragged him to a grate nearby. Pushing a button on the wall, he watched as the grate fell open and the remains dropped down a chute towards an incinerator. Dres pushed the rest down with his shovel, then they went back to work. The last body was a thin girl, barely into her teens with long, fragile-looking bones. Nothing to worry about with this one, Gorvan said, grinning under his mask. Drez said nothing. He just stood there, holding the girl and staring.
What's the matter, boy? You lost your funny bone already?
Drez looked up at him, before quietly carrying the body over to the grinder and pushing it in, watching until the girl's tiny feet finally vanished in a final spurt of blood. He looked back over his shoulder at Gorvan, his expression flat, almost cold.
My sister,
Drez told him. Then he walked back to the pile of corpses and began hanging up the next one.